Thanks for watching. When this channel hits 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a special giveaway, and one lucky new subscriber will win an iPhone 15 Pro Max. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss your chance.
I was already underground when the world decided to end, which meant I missed the moment everyone else panicked. There was no screaming, no crowds running past me, no phones buzzing with overlapping alerts. Down there, everything began the same way it always did. Quiet, controlled, routine. The space I was in wasn't a shelter or a bunker. It wasn't built for emergencies at all. It was functional, temporary by design. A place meant to be passed through and forgotten once its purpose was served. Concrete walls, reinforced doors, exposed conduits running along the ceiling. The air carried that familiar underground smell. Dust, metal, recycled oxygen. Nothing about it suggested safety. It was simply where I happened to be. I remember checking my watch and thinking about how long I'd be down there. Not long. An hour at most. Maybe less if everything went smoothly. I still believed in schedules then. I still believed that the surface followed rules. The first sign that something was wrong came through sound, not sight. A tone I didn't recognize cut through the steady hum of machinery. It wasn't loud, just wrong, too clean, too deliberate. The kind of sound designed to interrupt whatever you were doing and replace it with attention. I stopped moving and listened. A speaker crackled overhead, dormant equipment waking up all at once. For a moment, there was only static, the kind that fills silence rather than breaks it. Then a voice came, through, calm in a way that felt practiced rather than reassuring. This is an emergency broadcast. The words didn't land immediately. Emergency broadcasts belong to drills, to distant disasters that happened on screens. They didn't belong down there, in a place without windows, without crowds, without context. My first instinct was that it had to be a test. Someone had flipped the wrong switch. Someone would correct it. The voice continued anyway. It spoke about immediate threats, about remaining calm, about following official instructions. It mentioned containment. It mentioned public safety. It mentioned phrases I had heard before but never together. The message looped once, then started again, identical in tone and pacing. I looked around, half expecting someone else to react with me. There was no one, just concrete and light and the low vibration of systems that hadn't noticed anything had changed. I tried to picture what the surface looked like at that moment. Streets, buildings, people, frozen mid-task as the same words reached them. But imagination is weak when it has nothing to anchor to. Without windows, without feeds, without movement around me, the broadcast felt detached from reality. It was information without evidence. The message ended again and restarted. I checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual down there, but this time it mattered. I couldn't confirm anything, couldn't call anyone, couldn't see what everyone else was seeing. The emergency existed only as sound, echoing in a space never meant to explain. The world above it. I told myself to finish what I was doing. Panic didn't make sense yet. Emergencies were managed by staying put, following procedure, waiting for updates. That's what the voice said. That's what logic said. But the updates never came. The broadcast didn't evolve. It didn't escalate. It didn't clarify. It repeated itself exactly as if time had stalled at the moment the message was recorded. Each loop stripped it of urgency and replaced it with something worse: uncertainty. I realized then that whatever was happening up there had already moved past the point where anyone was explaining it in real time. The message wasn't reacting to events, it was surviving them. I became aware of how isolated I already was. Not trapped, just removed. The world was changing without me witnessing it. Decisions were being made without my input. Reactions were unfolding above my head while I stood in a place designed to separate people from consequence. That separation felt protective at first. The ground above me was thick. The doors were solid. Nothing rushed in. Nothing demanded immediate action. The emergency existed. Somewhere else, carried only by a voice that didn't know I was listening. I thought about going back up right then, about reaching the surface before things escalated. Further. The idea felt premature. Overreaction. The kind of mistake people make when they misunderstand scale. So I stayed where I was. I didn't know yet that being underground at the start meant I had missed the most important phase, the moment when escape was still instinctive, when the world above still behaved. Like the world I remembered. By the time I understood that, the broadcast had already looped so many times that it stopped sounding like a warning and started sounding like a record of something that had already happened. The emergency hadn't begun when I heard it. It had already started without me. After the third loop, the broadcast stopped feeling urgent and started feeling deliberate. The calm tone wasn't meant to guide people through unfolding events. It was meant to stabilize them, after control had already been lost. That realization crept in, slowly settling beneath the surface of my thoughts while the message continued to repeat without change. I stood beneath the speaker and listened for variation. None came. No updates. No added instructions. Just the same phrasing, the same pauses, the same measured cadence that suggested the message had been recorded early and released broadly, long before anyone could assess how bad things had become. Whatever was happening above me was already outside the scope of live response. Without visuals, sound took on more weight than it should have. Every word carried implication. When the voice said, "Remain where you are," I wondered who that instruction was for. People in offices, in cars, in their homes. It wasn't meant for someone underground without context. It assumed a shared understanding of space that I didn't have anymore. I moved deeper into the facility, following the cable trays toward a junction where communication equipment was housed. If there was any live feed, any emergency channel carrying updates, it would route through there. Screens powered on when I reached them, displaying status panels instead of news, green indicators, stable systems, no alerts. Beyond the broadcast itself, the disconnect sharpened. According to everything around me, nothing was wrong. Power held. Air circulated. Structural monitors reported nominal conditions. If this place were the only reference point, the emergency didn't exist. The broadcast was the only contradiction, AA. Voice insisting the world had changed while the environment argued otherwise. I tried the radio next, cycling through frequencies that usually carried surface chatter, police, bands, municipal services, transit coordination. Most channels returned static. A few crackled briefly with fragments, half sentences cut off mid-word, bursts of noise that sounded like movement rather than speech. Nothing lasted long enough to interpret. Nothing. Repeated. It was like listening to the end of something already finished. The broadcast restarted again, exactly as before. I noticed how my mind began filling in gaps automatically. I pictured streets emptying, sirens echoing, people clustering around screens and doorways. The lack of real information gave imagination free range, and imagination defaults to extremes when left unchecked. I forced myself to stop speculating. Speculation didn't help. Confirmation did. But confirmation wasn't available. The strangest part wasn't fear. It was detachment. Hearing about collapse without seeing it removed urgency from the equation. The emergency existed in theory, not experience. My body didn't react the way it should have because nothing in my immediate environment demanded it. I checked the time again and realized I had stopped caring how long I'd been there. Minutes, blurred into loops of the same message. Each repetition made the words feel less connected to action and more like an artifact, a recording meant to persist even if no one could respond to it anymore. I thought about the people above me hearing the same message in real time. Their experience would be different. They would see panic reflected in others' faces. They would feel movement, pressure, urgency. I was insulated from all of that. The emergency reached me, stripped of context, reduced to audio and implication. That insulation felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate yet. It delayed reaction. It encouraged waiting. Waiting made sense when information was incomplete. But if information never improved, waiting became a decision, not a pause. The broadcast mentioned shelters. It mentioned evacuation routes. None of that applied to someone already underground, separated from infrastructure designed for crowds and visibility. I wasn't part of the scenario the message imagined. I was an exception it didn't account for. I realized then that whatever happened next would be shaped by absence. Absence of visuals, absence of guidance, absence of urgency. My understanding of the outbreak would always lag behind reality because I had entered it blind. The voice continued its loop, steady and unchanging. I turned it off. Silence rushed in immediately, heavy and disorienting. Without the broadcast, the emergency felt less real, but also more dangerous. The message had been my only link to the surface. Cutting it severed the last thread of shared experience. Standing there in the quiet, I understood something fundamental had already happened. I wasn't experiencing the end of the world alongside everyone else. I was hearing about it. After the fact, filtered through systems that no longer adapted. Whatever the surface had become, I was already late to it. And being late, underground with only outdated words to guide me, meant that every decision from this point forward would be made without the benefit of seeing what I was walking into. The emergency broadcast hadn't told me what to do. It had told me that whatever I did next would be based on incomplete truth. Without the broadcast, the surface stopped feeling real. It didn't disappear exactly. It lost definition. Above me existed as a concept rather than a place, something I could describe in general terms but no longer visualize with accuracy. Streets, buildings, people, all of it, flattened into assumptions that hadn't been updated since before I went underground. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. The human mind depends on reference. When reference vanishes, it substitutes memory. What I pictured above me wasn't the present. It was the last stable version of the world I remembered, frozen at the moment. Before the emergency broadcast began looping, that mental image was comforting and dangerous at the same time. Time behaved differently underground. Without sunlight or noise from traffic, hours slipped by unnoticed. I marked them through system cycles, air exchange intervals, power checks, maintenance timers, but those were artificial markers disconnected from the rhythms that usually anchor reality. The surface could have changed dramatically while my environment remained unchanged. I tried to reconstruct what might be happening up there logically. If the broadcast existed, authorities had expected panic. If it was looping unchanged, they had lost the ability to update it. That suggested communication failure at scale. But logic without observation is fragile. Each conclusion rested on assumptions stacked on top of one another. The longer I stayed below, the less urgency I felt to confirm anything. That disturbed me. Urgency should have grown, not faded. Instead, the underground space normalized itself. Quickly, the concrete walls didn't react to disaster, the air didn't carry smoke, the ground didn't shake. Everything around me insisted on stability. I realized then that danger isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet enough to let your guard down completely. The idea of going back up began to feel abstract too. Not impossible, just disconnected. I knew where the access points were. I knew how long it would take to reach them, but imagining what waited beyond those doors felt like guessing rather than planning. Without updated information, ascent meant stepping into uncertainty without preparation. That uncertainty competed with the false clarity of staying put. Down here, I understood the rules. Systems behaved predictably. Risks were known. Above ground, the rules might have rewritten themselves entirely. The unknown grew larger the longer I delayed confronting it. I noticed how my thoughts framed the surface in past tense. I thought about how things had been, not how they might be now. Language shapes decision-making, and mine had already shifted. I wasn't thinking about returning to the surface. I was thinking about leaving the underground. That reversal mattered. The underground had become my reference point. The surface had become something external, almost foreign. When that happens, hesitation feels reasonable, rather than dangerous. I walked partway toward the exit and stopped. Not because I heard anything or sensed immediate threat, but because the idea of opening that door felt premature. The emergency broadcast had offered no reassurance. Silence offered even less. Acting without context felt like inviting chaos. So I stayed. With each minute, the surface became more theoretical. I knew it existed, but I no longer felt connected to it. Whatever people were doing up there, running, hiding, fighting, I wasn't part of it. I had entered the outbreak late, through delay rather than distance. That separation created a false sense of safety. If nothing had reached me yet, maybe nothing would. If the underground had shielded me from panic, maybe it would shield me from consequence too. The logic was flawed, but it felt convincing in the absence of contradiction. I began organizing what I could control instead, inventorying tools, checking power, reserves, assessing air circulation. Practical actions grounded me in the present environment, reinforcing its reality over the imagined chaos above. The more grounded I became down there, the less real the surface felt. It turned into a story, rather than a place, a dangerous one but distant, unfolding without me. I didn't realize it at the time, but that shift marked the true beginning of my isolation. Not physical isolation, but perceptual. The world above hadn't disappeared. It had become abstract. And once the surface becomes abstract, it stops influencing decisions the way it should. You stop reacting to danger and start managing absence. You stop preparing to face reality and start optimizing for delay. By the time I acknowledged how detached I had become, the underground wasn't just where I was. It was where my understanding of the outbreak had settled. Whatever waited above ground would no longer be met with instinct. It would be met with adjustment. And adjustment, when delayed too long, is how survival quietly turns into confinement. Once the surface slipped into abstraction, the underground demanded attention. I stopped, thinking about what might be happening above, and focused instead on what was holding my immediate world together. The space wasn't designed to fail gracefully. It was designed to function briefly and then be vacated. That distinction mattered more with every passing hour. Air came first. Ventilation systems hummed steadily, circulating filtered air through narrow ducts that assumed regular turnover of people, not prolonged occupancy. Gauges showed normal levels, but normal was defined by short-term use. Filters would clog eventually. Fans would wear. Nothing warned before degradation. Air didn't announce danger until it became dangerous. Power followed the same logic. The supply was stable, but not independent. It relied on upstream infrastructure I couldn't see or access. Backup systems existed, but their capacity was limited, intended to bridge gaps during maintenance or brief outages. They were not meant to support extended isolation. Every light I left on, every system I checked drew from a margin I couldn't replenish. Water was functional but conditional. Pipes delivered it reliably, but drainage assumed usage. Patterns tied to surface activity. If that activity had changed, if pressure shifted or pumps failed elsewhere, the underground would feel it eventually. Water systems rarely collapse. Suddenly, they degrade quietly, leaving little time to respond once the problem becomes visible. I walked the corridors and counted dependencies. Each system leaned on another, forming chains that only worked as long as the surface remained operational. The underground didn't exist independently. It borrowed stability from above, expecting repayment in the form of departure. That realization reframed my position. I wasn't hidden in a self-contained space. I was embedded in a larger organism that might already be failing. If the surface went dark, the underground wouldn't become safer. It would become fragile. The lights overhead flickered once, not enough to alarm, just enough to remind me that stability wasn't guaranteed. I froze, listening, watching for escalation. None came. The systems corrected themselves automatically, restoring equilibrium. The correction felt reassuring until I understood what it meant. Automation was compensating for stress, not eliminating it. I checked maintenance logs, scrolling through entries that assumed routine oversight, filters replaced on schedule, sensors calibrated monthly, power lines inspected regularly. None of that was happening now. Time-based maintenance only works when time is predictable. Underground time had already begun to blur. I calculated how long each system might last under ideal conditions. Then I recalculated, under worse ones. The margins shrank quickly. Hours stretched into days only if nothing went wrong. Nothing ever stays perfect during a collapse. The underground had sheltered me from panic, but it hadn't insulated me from consequence. It delayed exposure at the cost of dependence. The longer I stayed, the more I relied on systems that were quietly aging without support. I understood then that staying put wasn't neutral. It was a choice with a timer attached. Every hour underground traded immediacy for erosion. Leaving meant facing chaos. Staying meant trusting infrastructure that had never promised longevity. That was the first moment I questioned stillness as a strategy. The underground felt solid, but solidity built for hours behaves differently when stretched into days. What protected me now could suffocate me later, not through malice, but through neglect. I didn't panic. Panic wouldn't help, but the confidence I had gained from isolation cracked slightly, enough to let doubt in. The underground wasn't a sanctuary. It was a delay, and delays, once extended too long, turn into traps not because they close, but because the systems you depend on stop keeping up with time. I looked back toward the access point and measured the distance again. It hadn't changed. What had changed was my understanding of what staying meant. The underground hadn't been designed to save anyone. It had been designed to be forgotten once the surface moved on. At first, the systems behaved the way they always had, quietly, efficiently, without asking anything from me. That familiarity made it easy to forget how much explanation they used to provide. Status lights glowed green, indicators stayed within range. Everything appeared normal, which was exactly the problem. Automation is comforting when oversight exists somewhere else. Down there, oversight had vanished. The systems were still running, but they were no longer communicating why. They showed outcomes, not causes. Numbers updated without context, processes completed. Without commentary, if something changed, I would see the result, not the reasoning behind it. I noticed the shift while checking the ventilation controls. Airflow adjusted slightly, compensating for pressure variation upstream. The system logged the change but didn't flag it as an issue. No alert, no explanation, just a quiet correction. Under normal conditions, that adjustment would prompt a follow-up, a technician note, a review. Now it vanished into the log like it had always been expected. Power behaved the same way. Load redistributed itself across circuits when demand fluctuated, smoothing the curve without intervention. The system assumed the redistribution was temporary. It didn't consider that the original load source might never return. Automation isn't built to question permanence. It's built to correct deviation. That assumption extended everywhere. Pumps cycled, sensors recalibrated, backup. Systems tested themselves and went idle again. Each action implied confidence in a future state where human hands would resume control. The underground was still waiting to be reclaimed by routine. I realized then that automation wasn't adaptive in the way people imagine. It doesn't rethink purpose. It repeats behavior until parameters fail. As long as readings stay within acceptable bounds, the system believes everything is fine, even if the context that made those bounds meaningful has collapsed. I searched for diagnostic explanations, deeper logs that might reveal stress accumulation or deferred maintenance. Most of them required external authorization, credentials routed, through networks that were now silent. The systems weren't hiding information. They simply weren't designed to offer it without being asked by the right authority. That authority no longer existed. The absence of explanation made trust dangerous. If something failed, it wouldn't announce itself early. It would cross a threshold quietly and then stop working. Automation doesn't panic. It doesn't warn out of caution. It waits until numbers demand action. I imagined what that would look like underground. A fan slowing imperceptibly until air quality dipped too far. A pump compensating for pressure loss until it couldn't. Lights holding steady until the moment they didn't. None of those failures would come with narrative. They would arrive as facts. I tested the systems gently, introducing small variations to see how they responded. Each time, automation corrected and returned to baseline, unbothered. That reliability felt impressive and fragile at the same time. The corrections proved the system could adapt. Briefly. They didn't prove it could endure indefinitely. The deeper problem was psychological. When machines explain themselves, people stay engaged. When they don't, people drift into assumption. I caught myself doing exactly that. Trusting indicators instead of understanding them, the systems invited passivity by continuing to function. I stopped checking some panels as frequently because nothing ever changed. That was the trap. Automation had replaced vigilance with reassurance. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, and that design assumed someone else would eventually take over. I realized that if I stayed long enough, I wouldn't notice the moment when explanation mattered most. The underground wouldn't warn me when it stopped being viable. It would simply transition from functional to hostile without ceremony. That understanding shifted my relationship with the space again. I was no longer just waiting. I was borrowing time from systems that didn't know they were being asked to last longer than intended. Automation hadn't failed. It had stopped speaking, and silence, in a place built on invisible processes, was the most dangerous signal of all. The moment I decided not to go up wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of fear, no clear threat forcing me back. It was a quiet conclusion reached through exhaustion and incomplete information. Staying felt reasonable. Moving felt speculative. In an environment already stripped of context, speculation carried weight. I stood at the access point longer than I intended, hand resting against a surface worn, smooth by countless passes before mine. The path upward was intact. Nothing blocked it. No alarms sounded. If I left then, I would be acting on instinct rather than evidence. Instinct had value, but it also had a habit of exaggerating risk when information was scarce. The broadcast had offered no clarity. Automation offered no warnings. The surface existed only as abstraction shaped by memory and imagination. Going up meant choosing an unknown that I couldn't prepare for. Staying meant choosing an environment whose limits I couldn't at least measure, even if I didn't fully understand them yet. That distinction mattered. I told myself I would wait for one more update, one change in the broadcast, one clear signal that conditions above had stabilized or worsened. Waiting felt disciplined, not passive. It aligned with the idea that reaction without data was a liability. I returned to the center of the underground space and resumed monitoring systems, telling myself the delay was temporary. Minutes passed. Then hours. Nothing changed. The absence of escalation reinforced the decision. Each quiet interval made staying feel safer, more justified. The underground rewarded stillness. Systems stabilized under consistent load. Airflow smoothed. Power demand leveled out. Movement created variance. Variance triggered correction. Correction drew attention. Stillness blended into the background of automated expectation. I noticed how quickly my body adapted to the choice. Muscles relaxed. Breathing slowed. The tension I'd carried since the broadcast began faded slightly. That physical response was deceptive. Calm doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it means resignation to conditions that haven't challenged you yet. I considered the risks of waiting too long. If the surface deteriorated beyond recognition, leaving later would be harder. But that outcome felt distant, hypothetical. The immediate environment demanded less from me than the imagined chaos above. Humans are wired to prioritize what's present over what's possible. I reorganized the space subtly, not as preparation for long-term stay, but to reduce friction. Tools placed closer, supplies aligned for easier access. These changes felt temporary, reversible. In reality, they marked the first commitment to remaining. The thought crossed my mind that I might be missing the safest window to leave. I dismissed it quickly. Safe windows are obvious, I told myself. They announce themselves through clarity. This situation offered none. I rationalized the decision further. If authorities regained control, the broadcast would change. If evacuation became necessary, instructions would follow. The underground existed within infrastructure that assumed coordination would return. Trusting that assumption felt logical. That trust rested on a world that might already be gone. I didn't yet understand how powerful inertia could be, choosing not to act once made, choosing not to act again easier. Each cycle of inaction reframed stillness as strategy rather than delay. The underground began to feel less like a waiting room and more like a refuge. I checked the access point one last time before fully committing to that pause. It remained unchanged, silent, neutral. It neither invited nor discouraged departure. The choice rested entirely with me. I stepped away. The first decision to stay still wasn't about fear of what waited above. It was about comfort with what existed below. Familiar systems, predictable responses, and the illusion of control outweighed the uncertainty of a surface already slipping beyond imagination. I told myself I was being patient. I didn't realize yet that patience, once exercised without limits, becomes attachment. By the time I accepted that staying had become my default, the underground had already begun shaping my sense of time, risk, and possibility. The emergency hadn't forced me to hide. I had chosen stillness because it felt like the safest move in a world that had stopped explaining itself. And that choice, made quietly and without urgency, would define everything that followed. The first full day underground passed without me noticing when it began or ended. Time no longer arrived with cues I recognized. There was no sunrise filtering through gaps, no distant traffic fading in and out, no change in temperature tied to daylight. The underground existed, in a constant state, insulated from cycles that once anchored my sense of duration. I tried to impose structure immediately. I marked hours using system timestamps, checking them against my watch, aligning tasks to intervals that made sense on paper. But those measurements felt artificial. Numbers advanced, yet nothing around me changed to confirm them. Without external reference, time became an idea rather than an experience. Noise vanished first. Machines still hummed, but their sound blended into a single, unbroken layer. It didn't fluctuate the way surface noise did. There were no lulls, no crescendos, no random interruptions. Just continuity. That continuity was unsettling because it removed contrast. Without silence, I couldn't measure quiet. Without variation, sound lost meaning. I noticed how quickly my hearing adjusted. The hum faded into the background, replaced by internal sounds. Breathing, heartbeat, the scrape of a boot against concrete. Those noises felt louder than they should have, not because they were, but because nothing competed with them. The underground amplified the self. Light followed the same pattern. Overhead fixtures provided steady illumination, neither bright nor dim, calibrated for function rather than comfort. They didn't shift with time. Shadows stayed fixed. My eyes never adjusted to darkness or glare. Vision flattened into consistency. I began to feel suspended, not trapped, not confined, paused. The underground wasn't moving forward with the world. It wasn't moving backward either. It existed alongside time, without participating in it. Sleep became difficult. Without exhaustion tied to activity or light, my body resisted rest. When I did sleep, it was shallow and fragmented. I woke often, unsure how long I'd been, unconscious. Dreams bled into waking moments because there was no clear boundary separating them. I tried exercising to force fatigue, pacing corridors, climbing access ladders, repeating movements until my muscles burned. It helped briefly. Physical strain reintroduced. Consequence. But once I stopped, the stillness returned, heavier than before. I realized then that silence wasn't just absence of sound. It was absence of feedback. On the surface, noise reflected activity, danger, life. Underground, silence meant nothing was. responding to anything else. Cause and effect felt delayed or irrelevant. I caught myself speaking out loud just to break the monotony. The sound of my own voice startled me. It echoed differently than I expected, bouncing off walls in ways that made the space feel smaller. I stopped after a few words, suddenly aware of how foreign noise felt. Down there. The lack of light and noise began altering my sense of scale. Distances felt longer. Movements felt slower. A short walk felt like a journey because nothing along the way changed to mark progress. Without landmarks that evolved over time, space stretched. Unnaturally. I stopped trusting my internal clock. Minutes felt like hours. Hours vanished entirely. I had to check systems repeatedly just to reassure myself that time was passing at all. That reassurance felt necessary, not because I feared being stuck, but because I feared losing. Sequence, losing the sense that events still followed one another. The underground didn't oppose my presence. It absorbed it. The longer I stayed, the more. My expectations aligned with its constancy. I began to anticipate nothing happening, and that expectation fulfilled itself easily. That was the most dangerous shift. When nothing happens long enough, the absence of events becomes the norm. Any deviation feels intrusive rather than informative. I worried. What would happen if something finally did break the pattern? I noticed how my thoughts slowed, stretched to fill the silence. Without interruption. Ideas. Looped. I revisited the same questions repeatedly, not because they lacked answers, but because nothing displaced them. The emergency broadcast, the surface, the decision to stay, all replayed without resolution. Days without light or noise didn't feel threatening at first. They felt manageable even. Calming. But calm without stimulation isn't peace. It's suspension. The mind needs contrast. To stay oriented. Without it, awareness drifts inward, untethered from environment. I understood then that the underground wasn't just delaying exposure to the outbreak. It was reshaping perception. Each quiet hour eroded my connection to the world above, replacing it with a closed loop of thought and sensation. Time continued, I assumed. Systems cycled. My body changed. But without light or noise too. Mark progression, the days blended together, indistinguishable and interchangeable. The outbreak might have been raging above me, accelerating, evolving. Down there, everything slowed, stretched, and flattened into sameness. And sameness, sustained long enough, becomes its own kind of pressure. One that doesn't demand action but quietly teaches you how to stop expecting it. At some point, I turned the emergency broadcast back on, not because I expected new information, but because silence had begun to feel heavier than noise. The voice returned, instantly, as if it had been waiting, resuming the same message with the same cadence it had used from the beginning. Nothing about it acknowledged time had passed. That was when I realized the broadcast wasn't updating because it couldn't. It wasn't failing. It was finished. The message spoke as if the outbreak was still unfolding, as if authorities were actively coordinating, as if people listening could still respond in meaningful ways. None of that matched what I suspected was happening now. The words were no longer instructions. They were artifacts. I listened closely for any deviation, a change in emphasis, a new sentence, a different pause. There was nothing. The recording looped perfectly, each repetition identical to the last. The voice had been frozen at the moment it was created, and I was the one moving. Around it, that mismatch began to distort my sense of reality. The broadcast described a world that might no longer exist. Shelter-in-place orders assumed intact neighborhoods. Evacuation. Routes assumed traffic control. Emergency services assumed manpower. None of those assumptions could be verified from where I stood. Yet the voice still carried authority. I noticed how my body reacted to it. Even knowing it was outdated, my muscles tensed when it spoke. My attention sharpened. The broadcast still commanded compliance because it sounded official, measured, confident. It reminded me of a time when systems worked and instructions mattered. That was the danger. The message anchored my perception to the past. I began timing my activities around the broadcast cycles without realizing it. I waited for it to finish before moving. I paused when it restarted. The loop became a metronome for behavior, dividing time into artificial segments that had nothing to do with the present. I tried muting it again, but the silence felt wrong now. Too empty. Without the broadcast, I was alone with my thoughts and the hum of systems that refused to explain themselves. The voice, even outdated, provided structure. It filled space that would otherwise collapse inward. I understood then that information doesn't have to be accurate to be controlling. It just has to be familiar. The broadcast also shaped my mental image of the surface. Each time it mentioned safety, measures and coordination, it reinforced the illusion that order might still exist above me. That illusion delayed confrontation with the possibility that chaos had already settled into something permanent. I questioned myself constantly. Was I avoiding the surface because it was dangerous, or because the broadcast made me believe help was still coming? The message didn't promise rescue, but it implied continuity. It implied that waiting was reasonable. Waiting became easier with that implication playing on repeat. The longer I listened, the more detached I felt from whatever reality existed above ground. The broadcast replaced observation. It gave me a script to follow in place of understanding. I stopped asking what was happening and started asking how long I could wait before something changed. Nothing ever did. The voice continued, calm and unwavering, describing steps that no longer applied. It became a loop of reassurance without relevance. I realized that if I stayed long enough, this message might become my primary reference for the routed world, a world defined by frozen instructions and outdated expectations. That thought unsettled me more than silence ever had. I shut the broadcast off again, this time deliberately, resisting the urge to turn it back on. The quiet that followed felt deeper than before, but also more honest. Without the voice, there was no pretense of guidance. The truth was simple and uncomfortable. Whatever was happening above ground was no longer synchronized with the message meant to explain it. The broadcast had become a ghost of authority, lingering after control had already slipped away. If I continued relying on it, I would be making decisions based on a world that no longer existed. That realization marked another shift. The underground had already distorted time and perception. Now it threatened to distort judgment itself. Broadcasts that don't change don't inform. They preserve the past and resist the present. And the longer I listened to a voice that never adapted, the more I risked becoming like it. Stuck, repeating the same assumptions, waiting for conditions that would never return. I didn't know yet how I would respond to that truth. I only knew that if I stayed underground much longer, reality above me wouldn't just be delayed. It would be replaced entirely by a loop that had already ended. Once the broadcasts stopped shaping my days, something else took their place. My mind began filling the silence with a fixed image of the surface, an unchanging snapshot, assembled from memory, fragments of sound and assumption. It wasn't deliberate, it was protective. When information disappears, the brain preserves what it last understood, and treats it as current. In my head, the world above stayed suspended in the moment the emergency broadcast first played. Streets were tense but intact. Buildings stood undamaged. People were confused, frightened but still acting within recognizable rules. I pictured chaos as temporary, something unfolding toward resolution. That image remained stable no matter how much time passed below. The danger was how convincing it felt. Without new data, imagination doesn't evolve. It hardens. My mental model of the outbreak stopped updating because there was nothing to update it with. Each day underground reinforced the same picture, not because it was accurate, but because it was familiar. Familiarity masqueraded as truth. I noticed how this affected my decisions. When I thought about going back up, I wasn't preparing for a transformed world. I was preparing to step into the version I remembered. Dangerous, yes, but navigable. That assumption shaped planning in subtle ways. Routes I considered safe might no longer exist. Threats I expected might have changed form entirely. The underground encouraged this freeze. Nothing down there contradicted my assumptions. The walls didn't vibrate with distant collapse. The air didn't carry smoke or decay. Systems continued to operate as if the surface still supported them. The absence of evidence allowed memories to stand in for reality. I tested my thoughts by imagining worst-case scenarios. Cities overrun, infrastructure failing, long-term collapse. Each time my mind resisted, those images felt exaggerated, speculative. The frozen version felt more reasonable, even though logic suggested the opposite. The longer I stayed, the more my perception favored the least disruptive explanation. That bias scared me when I recognized it. Survival depends on accurate models of the environment. Mine was outdated by definition. Yet it felt current because nothing challenged it. I realized that if I waited long enough, the surface wouldn't just be unknown. It would be misknown. I would emerge with confidence built on fiction, expecting conditions that no longer existed. That kind of error doesn't announce itself until it's punished. The freeze also affected emotion. Fear dulled, urgency flattened. I didn't feel compelled to act because the world in my head wasn't deteriorating further. It was paused, waiting for me. Waiting is comforting when you believe time isn't working against you. I caught myself thinking, when things calm down up there. That phrase assumed a future that aligned with the past. It assumed calm was coming, not that a new normal had already replaced it. The underground had done more than delay my exposure to danger. It had delayed my understanding of change. Change requires contrast, and contrast was gone. Without new sights or sounds, my perception stopped moving. I forced myself to confront the possibility that the surface had already moved on without me. That whatever phase of the outbreak I had imagined was over. That what existed now might be something far less predictable than the chaos I feared initially. That thought made the frozen image crack. I didn't know what the surface had become. I only knew that my mental version of it was unreliable, preserved too carefully to be real. Staying underground protected me from immediate threat, but it also protected outdated assumptions from being challenged. The realization landed hard. If I continued waiting, my understanding wouldn't improve. It would fossilize. I wouldn't be safer when I eventually went up. I would be wrong. The outside world freezing in my head wasn't a passive effect. It was an active risk. It shaped decisions, dulled instincts, and made delay feel justified. Every hour underground strengthened a model of reality that drifted further from the truth. I stood there, surrounded by systems that hummed along without comment, and accepted something uncomfortable. Isolation hadn't just separated me physically. It had locked my perception to a moment that no longer existed. And if I didn't break that freeze myself, the first time I encountered the real surface again would be the moment I paid for every assumption I had protected in the dark. By the time the thought of leaving finally took shape, it didn't feel like a solution. It felt like a violation. The idea of going back up carried resistance that had nothing to do with danger, and everything to do with misalignment. The surface wasn't frightening anymore. It was incompatible. I stood at the base of the access route and felt it immediately. My body reacted before my mind could frame the reason. Breathing tightened. Movement slowed, not from panic, but from hesitation rooted deep enough to feel automatic. The underground had trained me well. It had taught me what safe felt like, and this wasn't it. The route upward was unchanged. Concrete steps, metal railings, a door that still opened. When tested, nothing blocked it. No alarms sounded. There was no physical barrier to overcome. The resistance existed entirely inside me, shaped by days of stillness and predictability. Going up meant noise. Even careful movement would echo differently near the exit. Sound traveled upward, not sideways. The underground absorbed it. The surface would reflect it. That difference mattered now. I had spent too long optimizing for silence to ignore what breaking it would cost. Light was another factor. Down below, illumination was constant and neutral. Above, light would be uncontrolled, harsh or dim, shifting without warning. My eyes had adjusted to stability. Sudden contrast would slow reaction, distort perception. It felt like stepping out of one set of rules into another without transition. I realized then that the underground had become a filter. It shaped behavior by rewarding predictability and punishing deviation. Going up meant abandoning that filter and accepting raw input again. Movement, sound, unpredictability. That wasn't just dangerous. It was overwhelming. I told myself to prepare logically. List risks, list benefits, but logic struggled to compete with conditioning. Every reason to go up had an equal counterweight shaped by habit. Information versus stability, agency versus control, possibility versus certainty. The underground favored the latter every time. The most unsettling part was how reasonable the resistance felt. It didn't feel like fear, it felt like experience, as if my instincts had evolved specifically to reject ascent. The longer I stayed, the more those instincts would harden. I thought about how people develop aversion in confined environments, how routines become comfort, how leaving a controlled space feels wrong even when freedom exists. Outside it, the underground had become my baseline. Anything else registered as disruption. I tested myself by climbing a few steps, stopping before the door. The air felt different. Already. Less processed, more variable. My heartbeat quickened, not because I sensed threat, but because the environment refused to behave predictably. That unpredictability had become intolerable. I stepped back down. That retreat didn't feel like failure. It felt like correction. The underground accepted me. Instantly, the familiar hum restoring equilibrium. My breathing slowed. Muscles relaxed. The contrast was undeniable. That was when I understood the trap had progressed beyond infrastructure and time. Distortion. It had reached instinct. The place had reshaped my threat assessment. It no longer mattered what was actually happening above. My body believed the underground was right. Why going up felt wrong had nothing to do with the outbreak itself. It had everything to do with prolonged alignment to a system that rewarded stillness, silence, and repetition. The surface represented variables. The underground punished variables. The danger wasn't that I couldn't go up. The danger was that, given enough time, I wouldn't be able to make myself want to. I returned to the center of the space and stood still, aware that the longer I waited, the stronger that resistance would become. The underground didn't need to lock me in. It only needed to make leaving feel incorrect. And it was succeeding. Going up felt wrong not because it was unsafe, but because safety had been redefined, around remaining exactly where I was. The first sound reached me through vibration rather than hearing. A faint tremor traveled along the concrete, subtle enough that I questioned whether I had imagined it. Underground. Spaces amplify uncertainty that way. Without reference, every anomaly feels suspect. I stayed still, letting the hum of systems settle, waiting to see if the sensation would repeat. It did. This time it carried rhythm, not mechanical, not part of the infrastructure I had learned to interpret. It came in uneven intervals, pressure transferred through structure rather than air. Something was moving above, and it wasn't following patterns I recognized. I moved slowly toward the section of the facility closest to the surface, keeping my steps. Measured. The underground responded as it always had, swallowing sound, stabilizing. Atmosphere. But the vibration persisted, faint and intermittent, like weight shifting where it shouldn't have been. I placed a hand against the wall and felt it again. A dull impact, followed by a scrape. The sound didn't echo. It didn't reverberate the way machinery did. It absorbed, dragging against material instead of striking it cleanly. Whatever caused it wasn't designed to move through. Structured space. My first instinct was to assume structural stress, debris falling, equipment settling. But those events followed rules. They happened once, then resolved. This didn't resolve. It returned. Irregular but persistent, as if something were testing the surface without understanding what lay beneath it. The underground offered no interpretation. Sensors remained calm. No alerts triggered. From the system's perspective, nothing had changed. That disconnect unnerved me more than the sound itself. When systems don't react, they leave judgment to the human, and my judgment had been dulled by isolation. I tried to locate the source by moving laterally, tracking where the vibration felt strongest. Each step carried calculation. Noise discipline still governed movement even now. I couldn't rush without betraying myself. The sound above continued, unconcerned with my caution. Another impact followed, closer this time. I felt it through the soles of my boots. The pressure lingered, then faded, replaced by a dragging noise that made my jaw tighten involuntarily. The sound didn't belong to chaos or panic. It belonged to persistence. I thought about the frozen image of the surface I had been carrying in my head. Order, struggling against collapse. People reacting, moving, shouting. This didn't match that image. There were no voices, no alarms. Just contact. Repeated, deliberate, and quiet enough to slip past systems that monitored for obvious threat. The realization hit slowly. Whatever was above had adapted to a world without response. It wasn't panicking. It wasn't fleeing. It was present. I backed away from the wall and listened again, forcing myself to separate fear from observation. The sound pattern shifted slightly, moving across the surface instead of focusing on one point. That suggested exploration rather than accident. The thought settled. Heavily. The underground, for all its control, had one blind spot. It filtered chaos, but it also filtered information. Subtle activity didn't register until it crossed thresholds designed for force, not intent. If something learned to operate below those thresholds, it could exist undetected. I stood there longer than was comfortable, letting the implications form. The underground had protected me from noise, but now noise was the only indicator that something external had reached my position. Not the broadcast, not automation, just physical contact with the structure itself. The sound faded eventually, retreating into silence so complete it felt intentional. I waited for confirmation it wouldn't return. Nothing followed. The hum of systems reclaimed the space, steady and reassuring. That reassurance felt false now. Noise from above that shouldn't exist meant the surface that hadn't just changed. It had moved. Closer. Whatever was happening up there wasn't contained by distance or abstraction anymore. It had reached the boundary between worlds. I didn't know if the sound came from the infected, from people, or from something worse, shaped by both. I only knew that my underground sanctuary had been noticed, even if not fully understood. The trap tightened without closing. I stepped away from the wall, aware that silence was no longer proof of safety. It was just the pause between tests. And if something above was learning, waiting, adapting, then my reluctance to go up wasn't protecting me. It was giving whatever waited above time to decide what to do next. After the noise faded, I couldn't return to routine. Whatever had brushed the surface above me hadn't breached anything, but it had erased the last illusion I was holding onto. That time. Underground meant time untouched. Preparation was no longer optional. It was just misaligned. I began planning for emergence the only way I could, using a version of the surface that lived entirely in my head. That was the first problem. Every checklist I wrote assumed conditions that might no longer apply. Streets I remembered open could be blocked. Buildings I expected intact could be hollowed out. Threats I prepared for might have evolved beyond recognition. I laid equipment out carefully, testing weight, balance, and access. Everything felt heavier than it should have. Not physically, but psychologically. Each item carried implication. Bringing too much meant slower movement. Bringing too little meant dependency on an environment I didn't understand. The underground had taught me optimization. The surface would punish it. I tried to recall the last normal day with precision, where traffic bottlenecked, which areas drew crowds, where noise traveled farthest. That information used to be valuable. Now it was historical. I didn't know which patterns still existed and which had been erased by collapse. Maps didn't help. They showed structure, not condition. They didn't tell me which routes were choked with debris, which spaces had become traps, which places now attracted movement instead of dispersing it. Preparation based on them felt like rehearsing for a play. That had already been rewritten. I practiced opening the exit quietly, repeating the motion until muscle memory returned. The door responded the same way every time, smooth and obedient. That consistency comforted me briefly until I realized it only applied to the first step. Beyond that threshold, everything was speculation. I staged supplies near the access point, telling myself it was temporary. That was another lie. Temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent when uncertainty delays action. Each item placed there anchored me a little closer to leaving, while also making delay easier. The noise from above replayed in my mind, stripped of context and exaggerated by imagination. It forced urgency into preparation, but urgency didn't translate into clarity. I was preparing for a surface that existed only as memory and assumption. I noticed how my thoughts oscillated between extremes. Either the surface was overrun, beyond recognition, or it had stabilized into something navigable. I prepared for both and neither at the same time. The lack of concrete threat made focus difficult. Fear thrives on ambiguity. The underground watched silently as I worked, systems humming along as if nothing had changed. That normalcy undermined preparation. It whispered that maybe I was overreacting, that the sound had been nothing, that I could wait a little longer. Waiting felt dangerous now, but preparation without departure felt like pretending. I understood then that the hardest part of leaving wasn't fear of what I'd face. It was accepting that my preparation would be wrong no matter how thorough it felt. There was no version of readiness that could account for a world I hadn't seen since before it broke. Preparing for a surface that no longer exists is an exercise in humility. It forces you to admit that planning has limits, that experience can mislead, and that survival may depend more on adaptation than foresight. I stood at the access point again, gear staged, path clear, listening for sound that didn't return. Silence stretched, thick with possibility. The underground felt stable, unchanged, patient. The surface did not. Whatever awaited me above had already moved on from the moment I remembered. I could either continue preparing for a past that felt safer to imagine, or accept that the only way to update my understanding was to confront reality directly. Preparation had reached its limit. Anything more would just be another way of staying underground while pretending I was getting ready to leave. The next decision wouldn't be about equipment or timing. It would be about whether I was willing to step into a world that no longer cared what I expected it to be. I didn't notice the change while it was happening. Change like that never announces itself. It accumulates quietly, disguised as adaptation, justified by circumstance. Only when I paused, long enough to measure myself against memory, did the difference become undeniable. The underground had reshaped my instincts first. On the surface, awareness once meant scanning outward, movement, sound, distance. Down here, awareness turned inward. I monitored breath, posture, noise I might create rather than noise approaching me. Threat. Perception inverted. I became more alert to my own actions than to the environment beyond. The walls. That shift carried consequences. My tolerance for unpredictability collapsed. Sudden sounds startled me more than sustained danger ever had. Variability felt hostile. The underground rewarded sameness, and my nervous system adapted to expect it. Anything outside that pattern registered as threat, regardless of actual risk. Time altered me next. Without natural markers, patience stretched unnaturally. I could wait for hours without discomfort, sitting in stillness that would have driven me restless before. That endurance felt like strength, until I realized it dulled urgency. The instinct to act before. Conditions worsened, weakened with every day spent below. Decision-making followed. Choices became smaller, safer, optimized for preserving equilibrium. I avoided actions that introduced uncertainty, even when uncertainty might have offered advantage. Staying still felt productive because nothing went wrong when I did. That logic reinforced itself relentlessly. I noticed the change in how I planned. I stopped thinking in terms of routes and started thinking in terms of positions. Movement was something to minimize, not exploit. The surface had trained me to adapt by relocating. The underground trained me to adapt by enduring. My body reflected it too. Muscles softened from lack of varied movement. Reflexes slowed, not from weakness but from overcalculation. I thought before acting now, even in moments that once demanded immediacy. Thought isn't always an advantage when speed matters. Emotion flattened in response. Fear dulled into background tension. Relief rarely arrived, because nothing resolved. The underground didn't offer highs or lows, only continuity. Over time, that continuity eroded emotional range, replacing it with neutrality that felt safe but empty. The most unsettling realization came when I imagined emerging. Not the danger, not the noise, but the pace. The surface would move faster than I was ready for. Decisions would need to be immediate. Information would arrive all at once. I had been living in a world that fed me data slowly, predictably, without overload. The underground hadn't just protected me physically, it had conditioned me psychologically. It trained me to survive in confinement, not in motion. That training might keep me alive, below, but it would betray me above. I thought about people who adapt too well to controlled environments, how they struggle when freedom returns. The underground was controlled, not by intention but by design. It limited stimulus, variability, and consequence. In doing so, it reshaped what I believed survival required. I wasn't weaker than before. That was the lie I almost accepted. I was specialized for a place that didn't represent the world anymore. The longer I stayed, the more incompatible I became with anything else. That realization carried grief I hadn't expected, not for the surface itself, but for the version of me that could move through it instinctively. That person still existed in memory, but memory isn't readiness. How long underground changed me wasn't measured in days. It was measured in habits that replaced instincts, in calm that replaced urgency, in patience that replaced momentum. I understood then that staying longer wouldn't preserve me. It would finish reshaping me into something that belonged only to this place. The underground had kept me alive during the opening phase of collapse. It had done its job too well. Now it was preparing me for a future that might never come. One where stillness was rewarded and movement punished. If I left, I would have to fight not just whatever waited above, but the version of myself that had learned how to survive without leaving. That was the true cost of time spent below ground. Not the risk I avoided, but the adaptability I was slowly losing. The choice didn't arrive all at once. It formed slowly, pressing in from opposite sides until the space between them narrowed enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Darkness below, chaos above. Neither promised safety. Both demanded commitment. The underground offered certainty. I knew its rhythms now. I understood how systems behaved under steady use, how silence settled, how time stretched without breaking. Staying meant accepting limits I had already adapted to. It meant fewer surprises, fewer variables, fewer moments that demanded instant reaction. Darkness had rules, and I had learned them. Chaos offered none of that. Whatever waited above ground had rewritten itself without me. The sounds I had felt through the ceiling hinted at persistence, not panic. Something up. There moved with purpose or habit, not confusion. Emerging meant confronting a reality that would not pause for adjustment. I tried to frame the choice logically, listing advantages the way I used to, staying preserved, resources, leaving restored information, staying reduced exposure, leaving restored agency. Each point cancelled another out. Logic couldn't resolve a decision rooted in incompatibility. The underground didn't push me to decide. That was part of its power. It allowed indefinite delay. As long as systems held, there was no deadline, no forced action. Chaos, by contrast, would demand response immediately. It would not allow hesitation. That difference made staying feel safer even as it hollowed me out. I recognized how temptation worked here. Darkness didn't threaten, it invited, it asked. Nothing beyond continued compliance. Every hour I stayed made the next hour easier to justify. The cost wasn't immediate. It accumulated invisibly. Chaos frightened me less than it should have. Fear had been worn smooth by isolation. What unsettled me was speed. Above ground, events would unfold faster than thought. I would need to react before understanding, adapt before analyzing. That kind of living felt foreign now. I imagined opening the door fully, letting light spill down into the underground, breaking the stillness I had shaped myself around. The image made my chest tighten. Not because of danger, but because of dissonance. Light meant exposure, movement, noise. It meant relinquishing control. Staying meant accepting that control had already replaced living. I realized then that this wasn't a choice between safe and unsafe. It was a choice between two kinds of loss. One gradual and internal, the other immediate and external. Darkness would take pieces of me slowly until there was nothing left to give. Chaos might take everything at once. The underground had taught me how to endure. It hadn't taught me how to re-enter a world that no longer paused to accommodate endurance. If I waited too long, endurance would be the only skill I had left. That understanding sharpened the decision without simplifying it. I could remain below and survive longer, but survival would narrow into existence defined by repetition and restraint. Or I could go up and risk being overwhelmed, misjudging a world that had already moved on. Neither path felt heroic. Neither felt final. That was the cruel symmetry of it. I stood between the two states, aware that indecision favored darkness. Chaos didn't wait. Darkness did. Every moment of hesitation tilted the scale without making a sound. The choice between darkness and chaos wasn't about courage. It was about timing. Choose. Too late. And darkness would become permanent. Choose too soon, and chaos would punish hesitation. I didn't decide yet, but for the first time since the emergency broadcast began, I stopped assuming that staying underground was neutral. It wasn't. It was a decision being made for me by comfort, silence, and the fear of losing control. And knowing that meant the next choice, whatever it was, would finally be intentional. The moment arrived without ceremony. No countdown, no surge of confidence, just the quiet understanding that waiting had stopped being caution and had become surrender. I stood at the threshold long enough to feel the underground pressing at my back. Not physically, but through habit and comfort, urging me to remain aligned with it. I opened the door slowly. Light spilled downward in a way that felt unfamiliar, not brighter, but less controlled. It didn't settle where I expected. Shadows didn't behave. The air carried movement, irregular and layered, carrying information I wasn't prepared to pass all at once. Smell arrived first. Stale, sharp, and distant, followed by sound that refused to organize itself into patterns. I paused, letting my eyes adjust, aware that adjustment itself had become a liability. The surface didn't wait for me to acclimate. It existed at speed, indifferent to my conditioning. What I saw didn't match the image I had preserved underground. Not chaos frozen in panic, not orderly collapse, but something quieter and more disturbing. The world had rearranged itself. Structures still stood, but they no longer suggested purpose. Open spaces felt avoided, rather than abandoned. Objects had been moved without care for restoration. The absence of people wasn't empty. It was deliberate. Whatever life remained here had learned where not to be. I took my first steps upward carefully, testing weight, balance, reaction. Each movement felt exaggerated, as if my body had forgotten how to negotiate uneven ground. The underground had taught me precision. The surface demanded improvisation. My hesitation cost me more than my caution ever had below. Sound arrived in fragments, not the constant noise I'd imagined, but isolated cues that demanded interpretation. A distant scrape, a hollow impact, wind moving through something. Loose. Each one required judgment without confirmation. Down below, silence had been stable. Up here, silence was just the gap between signals. I realized then how far behind I was. The surface had already developed its own language, one built from absence and implication rather than instruction. The emergency broadcast had prepared people for panic. It hadn't prepared anyone for endurance. That phase had passed without me. I moved farther from the entrance, forcing myself not to retreat when instinct suggested it. Every step required effort, not because of danger, but because my sense of pace had been reset underground. I had to relearn urgency without panic, caution without paralysis. The world hadn't ended the way I expected. It had thinned. Activity had consolidated into patterns I didn't recognize yet. Threat didn't announce itself. It existed as pressure, as positioning, as places that felt wrong without explaining why. I understood then that emerging wasn't a return. It was an arrival into a present I hadn't earned context for. The underground hadn't saved time. It had removed me from it. The cost of that removal was now due. I didn't regret going below when the broadcast began. It had kept me alive during the most volatile phase. But I saw clearly now what it had taken in exchange. I was late to a world that had already learned how to survive without explanations. Standing there, exposed and recalibrating, I felt something shift, not fear, not relief, but engagement. The surface demanded attention again. It punished assumption and rewarded adaptation. It forced my senses outward instead of inward. The underground had taught me how to endure. The surface demanded that I live again, even if living meant accepting risk without preparation. I didn't know how long I would last up here. I didn't know if leaving had been the right decision. Those questions didn't matter the way they used to. What mattered was that I was participating in reality again, not managing a delay. I took one more step forward and let the door close behind me, not sealing anything, just marking a boundary I had crossed by choice. The world hadn't waited for me. It had moved on, adapted, and hardened into something unfamiliar. Stepping into it felt like learning a new language mid-conversation. But it was a language spoken by everything still moving, still reacting, still alive. And for the first time since the emergency broadcast began, I wasn't listening to a loop anymore. I was answering it.